You are standing in a swamp. It is roughly 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the lower Yangtze River Valley in what is now eastern China. Your feet are sinking into warm mud. The air is thick, humid, heavy with insects, and growing all around you, poking out of shallow water in loose, scraggly clumps, is a plant you have seen your entire life but never thought much about: wild grass. Thin stalks, tiny seeds wrapped in a tough, inedible husk. If you picked one of those seeds right now and tried to eat it raw, you would chew for 30 seconds, get nothing useful out of it, and spit it into the mud. It is small. It is hard. It does not taste like food. It does not look like food. There is absolutely no obvious reason to think this waterlogged weed is worth your time when there are fish in the river, deer in the forest, and tubers in the ground that you can eat right now with almost no effort. And yet someone, standing in mud just like this, looked at that useless little grass seed and decided it was worth the trouble. That decision, made quietly, probably without anyone understanding what it meant, is the reason half the human beings alive on Earth today eat the same grain for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Over 3.5 billion people depend on it for at least a fifth of their daily calories. Global production now exceeds 530 million tons every year. India and China alone grow more than half of it. In dozens of languages, the word for rice and the word for meal are the same thing. In Japanese, gohan means cooked rice. It also means meal. Breakfast is asa gohan, literally morning rice. Dinner is bangohan, evening rice. In Mandarin, qifan, literally eat rice, just means have you eaten. In Thai, kin kao, eat rice, means the same thing. In Korean, bap means rice, and it means meal. When half the planet cannot even describe the act of eating without saying the word rice, you are no longer talking about a crop. You are talking about the foundation of human civilization itself. So how did we get here? How did a swampweed become the most important food on Earth? The answer starts with a climate disaster. Involves at least 4,000 years of accidental plant breeding, 2 independent domestications on 2 different continents, a genetic puzzle that scientists are still arguing about, and one myth that almost everyone believes that turns out to be completely wrong. This is Ken. Let's start with the myth, because it is the one thing most people think they know about rice farming, and it sets the entire story off course. Most people assume rice farming was invented the same way they imagine all farming was invented. Someone had a bright idea, planted some seeds, harvested them, and boom, agriculture. As if one clever person figured it out one afternoon and told everyone else. That is not what happened, not even close. Rice domestication was not an event, it was a process. A brutally slow, mostly accidental process that took somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years from start to finish. For comparison, the entire Roman Empire rose and fell in less time than it took humans to turn a wild grass into a reliable crop. Nobody invented rice farming. They stumbled into it, generation after generation, without ever realizing they were doing it. And the evidence for that is sitting in the mud of a place called Shangshan. Shangshan is an archaeological site in Zhejiang province, in the lower Yangtze River Valley. In the late 1990s, Chinese archaeologists began excavating what turned out to be one of the oldest rice-related settlements on Earth. The site dates to roughly 10,000 years ago. What they found there were not farms, not fields, not rows of planted crops. What they found were scattered remains of wild rice, mixed with the tools and pottery of hunter-gatherers who were collecting, not cultivating, that grain. These people were foraging rice the same way they foraged nuts and tubers. They were picking it from wild stands, hauling it back to their camp, and processing it with stone flake tools. There were no sickles, no plows, just small, crude implements used to scrape and husk individual seeds. But here is the detail that changes the story. In 2024, researchers from the Institute of Geology and Geophysics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences published a study in Science using phytolith analysis, microscopic plant fossils preserved in the soil, to trace the evolution of rice at Shangshan and across the broader Shangshan cultural area over thousands of years. They examined bulliform cells, tiny silica structures in rice leaves, which differ in shape between wild and domesticated varieties. What they found was a continuous, unbroken sequence of change in the rice itself. Over a span of nearly 4,000 years, the bulliform cells shifted gradually from wild type to domesticated type. That is not someone planting a crop. That is natural selection being quietly redirected by human behavior without anyone understanding what they were doing. Think about what that means for the invention of rice farming. These people were not farmers. They were foragers who happened to prefer certain rice plants over others. They harvested the ones that were easiest to collect. They carried those seeds back to camp. Some of those seeds fell on the ground near the settlement and sprouted. The next year, the plants growing near camp were slightly different from the ones growing in the wild because they came from seeds that humans had unconsciously selected. And this happened over and over, year after year, century after century, for 3,000 to 4,000 years, until the rice growing near human settlements was genetically distinct from the rice growing in the wild. Nobody designed this. Evolution did most of the work. Humans just gave it a nudge. And there's another piece of the Shangshan puzzle that deserves attention because it connects to why humans bothered with rice in the first place: the climate. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the lower Yangtze was cold and dry. Temperatures were 4 to 6 degrees Celsius lower than today. Wild rice, Oryza rufipogon, needs warm, wet conditions to thrive. It could not have grown there in large quantities. But as the Ice Age ended and the Holocene began, roughly 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose, monsoons intensified, and the Yangtze lowlands transformed into a patchwork of marshes, lakes, and seasonal wetlands. These were exactly the conditions wild rice needed. The swamps filled with it, and the people living there began collecting it, not because they planned to domesticate anything, but because a new food source had appeared in their backyard, and they were hungry. The warming climate did not cause rice farming. It made rice farming possible. Now, here is where the science gets genuinely complicated, because the question of where rice was domesticated has been one of the most fought-over debates in modern archaeology. For decades, there were two camps. One camp said rice was domesticated once, in China, and then spread everywhere else. The other camp said rice was domesticated independently in at least two places, China and India, because the two main subspecies of rice, japonica and indica, are genetically different enough that they seem to have separate origins. Japonica is the short-grain sticky rice you eat with sushi. Indica is the long-grain fluffy rice you eat with curry. They look different, they cook differently, they grow in different climates, and their DNA suggests they diverged from different populations of wild rice, specifically the wild ancestor Oryza rufipogon. In 2017, archaeobotanist Dorian Fuller at University College London and geneticist Michael Peruganen at New York University published a study that proposed a solution so strange it sounds like a paradox. They called it the rice paradox: multiple origins, single domestication. Here's what that means. Japonica rice was domesticated first in the Yangtze River Valley, starting around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. That is the one clear, well-documented domestication event. But indica rice, the kind grown across India and Southeast Asia, was not domesticated from scratch. Instead, local farmers in the Ganges Basin and elsewhere were already managing wild rice populations, exploiting them as a food source, when japonica arrived from the east, probably around 2000 BC. The two mixed. Domesticated japonica hybridized with local wild species including Oryza nivara and the domestication genes, the specific mutations that make rice useful to humans, transferred from japonica into the proto-indica populations through introgressive hybridization. One domestication, but two origins. The single most important of those domestication genes is called SH4. It controls shattering. In wild rice, the grain detaches from the stalk as soon as it is ripe and falls to the ground. That is how wild plants spread their seeds, a survival mechanism perfected over millions of years of evolution. But if you are a farmer trying to harvest grain, shattering is a disaster. You walk through a field of ripe wild rice and half the grain falls off before you can collect it. The SH4 mutation prevents shattering. The grain stays attached to the stalk until you cut it. That one genetic change, which took centuries or millennia to become fixed in cultivated populations, is the difference between foraging and farming. And the evidence from Tianluoshan, a site in eastern China dated to roughly 7,000 years ago, shows exactly how slowly this happened. In 2009, Dorian Fuller and Zhang Yunfei published a landmark study in Science, analyzing thousands of spikelet bases from Tianluoshan. The spikelet base is the tiny attachment point where the grain connects to the stalk. In wild rice, this scar is smooth because the grain is designed to fall off cleanly. In domesticated rice, the scar is rough and torn because the grain had to be ripped off by a human. Fuller and Zhang found that over a 300-year window at Tianluoshan, roughly 6,900 to 6,600 years ago, the proportion of non-shattering, domesticated-type spikelet bases rose from roughly 27% to 39%. At the same time, rice went from 8% to 24% of all plant remains at the site, and the number of arable weeds, plants that only grow in disturbed cultivated soil, increased alongside it. That is not a revolution, that is a slow drift. After 7,000 years of humans harvesting this plant, it still was not fully domesticated. It took until roughly 6,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries, before the non-shattering trait was fixed, and rice truly became a crop you could reliably farm. 4,000 years from first contact to finished product. That is the actual timeline of rice domestication. And that alone should destroy the myth that someone invented rice farming one day. But once it was domesticated, what happened next was extraordinary. By roughly 3300 BC, the Liangzhu culture had emerged in the Yangtze River delta. Liangzhu was a full-blown civilization, with walled cities covering over 300 hectares, elaborate jade workshops producing some of the finest carved jade in the ancient world, sophisticated canal systems stretching across the landscape, and a social hierarchy so rigid that elite burials contained hundreds of jade kong tubes and bai discs, while commoner graves held a few pieces of pottery. What powered all of it was rice. The Liangzhu people built an infrastructure of dams, reservoirs, and canals that allowed them to manage water flow across entire landscapes, turning swampland into productive paddy fields. They generated enough surplus rice to feed a dense urban population, which freed up labor for jade carving, construction, administration, and ritual. Rice surplus built the city built the civilization. And when the monsoons shifted around 2300 BC and catastrophic flooding overwhelmed their water infrastructure, the civilization collapsed. Speleothem records, mineral deposits inside caves that record ancient rainfall patterns, confirm an extreme period of monsoon rainfall around 4,300 years ago. A thin layer of clay sits directly on top of the Liangzhu ruins. Everything they built, everything rice made possible, drowned in the mud it grew from. In 2019, UNESCO inscribed the archaeological ruins of Liangzhu City as a World Heritage Site. Now, here is something that most histories of rice leave out, and it matters for understanding why rice farming spread the way it did. Rice is one of the most labor-intensive crops ever cultivated by humans. Growing rice in paddies, wet rice cultivation requires flooding a field to a precise depth, maintaining that water level for weeks, transplanting seedlings by hand into the flooded soil, weeding constantly because weeds thrive in the same wet conditions rice does, and managing drainage at exactly the right time before harvest. This is not wheat farming, where you scatter seeds on dry ground and wait. This is hydraulic engineering, performed by hand, in mud, under a burning sun, every single growing season. And the earliest paddy fields we have found archaeologically, at sites like Changshan and Kuahuqiao in China's Taihu Lake region, date to roughly 6,000 years ago. They show small, organized field units no bigger than 10 square meters, with irrigation ditches, sluice pits, and drainage channels already in place. Somebody figured out water management in a rice field 6,000 years ago. That is not simple. That is engineering. And rice demanded something else that shaped the entire structure of human societies that grew it. It demanded cooperation. You cannot farm rice alone. One family cannot build and maintain a paddy irrigation system by itself. You need your neighbors to agree on water schedules, on planting dates, on when to flood and when to drain. If the farmer upstream diverts all the water to his field, the farmer downstream gets nothing. Rice farming requires a social contract, an agreement between people who depend on the same water source, enforced not by law, but by mutual need. In Bali, this problem was solved over 1,000 years ago by a system called the subak. Anthropologist J. Stephen Lansing, who studied Balinese rice farming starting in the 1970s, documented how water temples run by priests coordinated planting schedules across entire watersheds. The system is rooted in Trihita Karana, a Balinese Hindu philosophy of maintaining harmony between humans, nature, and the spiritual world. The temples synchronized when each farmer flooded their field and when they drained it, which controlled pests and distributed water equitably. When the Indonesian government tried to override this system during the Green Revolution in the 1970s and told farmers to plant continuously using chemical pesticides, the result was ecological disaster. Pest outbreaks exploded because the synchronized fallow periods that had been controlling insect populations were eliminated. The traditional system, the one run by temple priests who had been managing rice irrigation for centuries, turned out to be more scientifically effective than the government's modern plan. UNESCO recognized the Balinese subak as a World Heritage Site in 2012. And speaking of the spread of rice farming, from the Yangtze Basin, rice moved outward in every direction over thousands of years, southward into Southeast Asia by roughly 2500 to 2000 BC, carried by migrants who brought their farming knowledge and their seed stock with them. At Kok Phanom D in Thailand, excavated by archaeologist Charles Hyam in the 1980s, researchers traced the transition from coastal foraging to rice cultivation in a single community. Westward into the Indian subcontinent by roughly 2000 BC, where Japonica hybridized with local wild species to produce what we now call indica. At Lahuradewa in Uttar Pradesh, excavations revealed rice remains dating to around 6500 BC, but whether this represents true domestication or the management of wild rice stands is still debated. Northward to Korea around 1500 BC, triggering the Mumun pottery period. And from Korea to Japan around 1000 BC, where it arrived with such force that it transformed an entire civilization. Japan before rice was the Jomon culture, mobile hunter-gatherers who lived off the sea and the forest for over 10,000 years. Japan after rice was the Yayoi culture, settled farmers living in permanent villages, storing surplus grain, developing social hierarchies, and building the foundations of the society that would eventually become the Japanese state. Rice did not just arrive in Japan, it rewired the country. And while all of this was happening in Asia, something remarkable was happening in West Africa, independently, without any contact with Asia. People in the inner Niger Delta, in what is now Mali, domesticated an entirely different species of rice. Oryza glaberrima, African rice, was bred from a wild ancestor called Oryza barthii, roughly 3,000 years ago. It is a completely separate domestication event from Asian rice. Different species, different continent, different wild ancestor, different farmers, same idea. People saw a grass growing in wet ground and figured out how to make it feed them. African rice is hardier than Asian rice, more tolerant of drought and pests, but it produces lower yields. When the Portuguese brought Asian rice to West Africa in the 16th century, it gradually replaced African rice in most commercial agriculture. But Oryza glaberrima is still grown by some farmers today, valued for its resilience and its taste. And here is where the story of rice takes a turn that most people never learn about. When European colonists established rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia in the 17th and 18th centuries, they faced a problem. They did not know how to grow rice. Rice was not a European crop. The knowledge did not exist in England or France or Spain. Europeans had never farmed in flooded fields. They had no experience with tidal irrigation or tropical grain management. But that knowledge did exist in West Africa, where people had been growing rice for thousands of years. Geographer Judith Carney, in her 2001 book Black Rice, The African Origins of Rice Cultivation in the Americas, documented how plantation owners specifically purchased enslaved people from the rice coast of West Africa, from Senegambia and the Upper Guinea coast, precisely because those people possessed generations of expertise in rice cultivation. The hydraulic engineering, the tidal irrigation systems, the planting techniques, the threshing and milling tools, the winnowing baskets, All of it was brought to the American South by enslaved Africans who knew how to grow rice because their ancestors had been growing it for thousands of years. The rice economy of colonial America, which made South Carolina one of the wealthiest colonies in British North America, was built on stolen knowledge and stolen labor. The traditional story credits European planters with inventing American rice farming. Carney's research proved that the real inventors were the people those planters enslaved. Now, let's talk about the animal that made large-scale rice farming possible in Asia, because without this animal, wet rice cultivation would have stayed small. The swamp water buffalo was domesticated somewhere along the China-Indochina border roughly 3,000 to 7,000 years ago, and its anatomy is built for rice paddies in a way that seems almost absurdly convenient. Its hooves are wide and splayed, spreading the animal's weight across the mud so it does not sink. Its legs are jointed for walking through waterlogged soil. It can plow through wet clay that would trap a horse or an ox within minutes. For thousands of years, the water buffalo was the living tractor of the East, the engine that allowed a single family to cultivate a much larger area of paddy land than human labor alone could manage. Its dung fertilized the fields, its hooves aerated the soil, it even ate the weeds. The relationship between the water buffalo and the rice farmer is one of the oldest and most successful agricultural partnerships on Earth, and in many parts of rural Southeast Asia, it still continues today. And then, in 1966, the modern world tried to do to rice what it had done to wheat. The International Rice Research Institute, IRI, based in Los Baños in the Philippines, released a rice variety called IR8. It was developed by plant breeders Peter Jennings and Henry Beechel by crossing a tall Indonesian variety called Peta with a short, sturdy Taiwanese variety called Di Jiao Wu Gen. Peter Jennings identified a single recessive gene for shortness, SD1, that prevented the plant from growing tall and falling over when heavy with grain. IR8 was semi-dwarf. It had short, strong stalks that stayed upright even when loaded with rice. Conventional rice varieties produced maybe 1 to 2 tons per hectare. IR8 produced 4 to 5. The Philippine press coined the term miracle rice in June 1966. The impact was immediate. IR8 helped avert famines across India, the Philippines, and Pakistan during a period when hundreds of millions of people were at risk of starvation. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos and U.S. President Lyndon Johnson both visited IRI that year to witness the results firsthand. But miracle rice had a cost. The Green Revolution accelerated the ecological toll of intensive agriculture, and here is a number that most people do not know. Rice paddies are responsible for roughly 10 to 12% of global human-caused methane emissions. Flooded fields create oxygen-free conditions in the soil where methanogenic archaea thrive, producing methane as they decompose organic matter. Approximately 40 to 60 million metric tons of methane enter the atmosphere from rice paddies every year. 5 countries, China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Thailand, account for roughly 78% of those emissions. The crop that feeds half the world is also warming it. That is a trade-off that nobody who stood in that Yangtze swamp 10,000 years ago could have anticipated. And rice consumes water at a staggering rate. Up to 40% of the world's agricultural freshwater goes to rice paddies. Feeding half the planet requires flooding a significant fraction of it. And there's one more detail from that Shangshan site that deserves mention, because it ties the beginning of the story to something deeply human. In 2024, a separate study published in PNAS analyzed pottery fragments from Shangshan dating to roughly 10,000 to 9,000 years ago. Using phytolith, starch, and fungi analysis, the researchers found residues of fermented rice beverages inside the pottery. Rice beer brewed using a starter mold called ku, containing yeast and fungi. These early farmers or pre-farmers were not just eating rice, they were drinking it, brewing it for feasts and ceremonies. The researchers proposed that the demand for fermented beverages for communal gatherings may have been one of the social forces that pushed people to cultivate rice more intensively in the first place. Before the crop, the party. That is a very human origin story. So, the answer. How did humans invent rice farming? They did not invent it, not the way you invent a tool or a machine. Rice farming assembled itself slowly over roughly 4,000 years in the swampy lowlands of the Yangtze River Valley. as hunter-gatherers who were foraging wild rice unconsciously selected for plants that were easier to harvest. The non-shattering mutation, the single genetic change that turned a wild grass into a farmable crop, took millennia to become fixed. Nobody planned it. Nobody understood the genetics. Nobody woke up one morning and said, "I'm going to invent agriculture." They just kept harvesting the plants that held onto their seeds, and evolution did the rest. Then they figured out how to flood a field on purpose, how to transplant seedlings into rows, how to manage water across an entire landscape. They partnered with a water buffalo that could plow the mud. They built terrace systems into mountainsides. They coordinated water schedules through temple priests. And then a laboratory in the Philippines crossed two varieties and tripled the yield, feeding 1 billion extra people and heating the atmosphere in the process. The probability that rice farming was invented only once, in one place, and spread from there, based on the genetic and archaeological evidence, is roughly 70 to 75% for Asian rice specifically. The Yangtze River Valley origin is well established, and the indica subspecies almost certainly acquired its domestication traits through hybridization with japonica, rather than through a fully independent domestication process. But if you zoom out and ask whether rice farming was invented only once on Earth, the answer changes completely. It happened at least twice, once in China, once in West Africa. 2 species, 2 continents, 2 completely independent events. The probability that rice farming is a convergent invention, something humans would figure out wherever the right conditions existed, is nearly certain, above 95%. Wherever there is a warm swamp and a wild grass with starchy seeds, eventually a human will figure out how to turn it into a meal. It appears to be inevitable. And here's the part that connects all 10,000 years of this story to the plate sitting in front of you tonight. Rice is a swamp weed. That is all it has ever been, a grass that grows in wet ground. And from that single plant, humans built irrigation systems, hydraulic engineering, cooperative labor networks, city-states, empires, trade routes, and an agricultural economy that now covers more than 160 million hectares of the Earth's surface. Half the languages in Asia cannot separate the concept of eating from the concept of rice. You cannot say dinner in Japanese without saying rice. That is not a crop. That is an identity. Tomorrow, somewhere in Southeast Asia, a farmer will wake up before dawn, walk barefoot into a flooded field, and bend over in the mud to transplant rice seedlings by hand, one at a time, in rows, the same way it has been done for thousands of years. The tools are a little better, the seeds are a little different, but the work is the same work that someone did in the Yangtze River Delta 6,000 years ago. And the plant they are planting is the direct descendant of a wild grass that nobody had any reason to care about, until somebody knee-deep in a swamp decided it was worth the trouble. Every grain of rice you have ever eaten descends from that decision, and nobody remembers who made it, because it was not one person and it was not one moment. It was 10,000 years of humans and a grass changing each other, so slowly that neither one noticed. This has been Ken. See you in the next one.